Thank you, Edie, for providing us with that insightful context to frame today's conversation. Before moving on with today's proceedings, I'm going to briefly introduce Intergenerational Dialogue Series that it's been. I'm going to keep it as brief as possible in the interest of time, after which I would welcome the panel to take a seat. The social cohesion thematic recognizes the present crisis as a manifestation of the cycles of violence that we've been studying. As we renegotiate the social contract, it is pivotal that we recognize the systemic and structural elements that influence the eruption beyond the short-term impact on the economy. In doing so, we see it as our role as civil society to guide the conversation as it pertains to the grounded realities of the country and country's context, as well as socialize the conversation moving forward while lobbying for the same. This panel was designed to initiate a conversation on economic justice with the hope that we could collectively engage as civil society in ensuring inclusive and intersectional justice. The Intergenerational Dialogue Series, organized by CEPA, aims to generate knowledge of past events surrounding the civil conflict that spanned 3 decades, to promote reconciliation, non-recurrence, and social responsibility through intergenerational discussions. The sustainable peace in Sri Lanka. CEPA's working hypothesis on ideas is that it's imperative to contextualize the present within Sri Lanka's violent past, and in doing so, the conversation needs to take place between generations to ensure cohesive understanding of the problem. The 5th installation is happening today, and the first was launched with the discussion by Reverend Kalkande Dhammananda Thero, titled Loving Kindness for Inner Peace, on the 6th of December 2019. The conversation was a guided meditation session that prompted the participants to tap into their inner healing. The second dialogue was held in August of 2020 with the late Dr. Mythri Jegathesan on the challenges to memorialization, titled Memorialization and Community. The third dialogue was an online discussion under the COVID context with author and activist Clara Kabir. Clara shared insights from her book Voices of Peace, and we looked at an anthology of stories sampling combatants from Sri Lankan Armed Forces and the LTTE. The 4th installation, we brought in a carrefour of art, identity, technology, and conflict in relation to the youth demographic of the country. In doing so, we conducted a research under the title Youth and Identity Discourse in Post-War Sri Lanka, which was then further discussed as a part of the panel. So now I would like to briefly introduce our panelists. I would welcome Ms. Bhavani Fonseka, Ms. Natasha Palansuriya, Dr. Mythri Jegathesan, and Mr. Shiran Fernando to kindly take it. To introduce our panel, first of all, I would like to thank you all for attending this event. We are happy to have a physical event after a while and to have our CEPA team and audience with us. Just before starting off, I would like to tell our virtual participants if there are any questions, please be kind enough to hold them until the Q&A session at the end, and any questions should be directed to the CEPA chat, which you can see on our Zoom conversation. A brief introduction of our panelists. Ms. Natasha Palansuriya is an independent consultant working in the development sector, offering research and advisory services. Prior to this, she was a senior researcher at the Center for Poverty Analysis, leading the social cohesion thematic. She's a PhD candidate at City University of London and successfully defended her thesis at her Viva in December 2020 and is in her correction stage. PhD research focuses on Sri Lankan Tamil transnational engagement in post-war justice. Her areas of research expertise includes transitional justice, reconciliation, diaspora and diaspora engagement, transitional activism, governance, and democracy. Natasha has a master's in international reconciliation process of I apologize. Natasha has a master's in international politics and human rights from City University of London, where her dissertation explored the reconciliation process of Sri Lanka. Natasha also has a first-class honor bachelor's degree in journalism and media from Coventry University. Dr. Mythri Jegathesan is a social scientist and associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at Santa Clara University. She earned her PhD in anthropology from Columbia University in New York and has been researching gender and labor dynamics in Sri Lanka's tea plantation sector since 2008. Her book, Tea and Solidarity, Tamil Women and Work in Post-War Sri Lanka, published in 2019, is a 10-year ethnographic study of plantation life and work in South Central Sri Lanka and was awarded the 2020 Diana Forsyth Prize and 2021 Michelle the Rosaldo Award for its contribution to both science and technology and feminist anthropological studies. Bhavani Fonseka is a constitutional lawyer and a prominent human rights lawyer and activist in Sri Lanka. She is a researcher and attorney at law at the Center for Policy Alternatives. She's a member of the Human Rights and Watch, and she was advisor to the Consultation Task Force on Human Rights and member to formulate the National Human Rights Action Plan in Sri Lanka. She is counseling cases in the Supreme Court of Sri Lanka. She did her bachelor's degree in law from the University of Bristol and her master's in law from Denver University and master's in public administration from Harvard University. Bhavani Fonseka was a Mason Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School for the period of 2013-2014, and in 2015, she was selected to participate in the second Women's Leadership Program for Eisenhower Fellow. Shiran Fernando is the Chief Economist at the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce and leads the Economic Intelligence Unit, which is the focal point of the Chamber for Economic Research and Policy Advocacy. He was previously a member of the Steering Committee of the Economic Policy of the CCC. Shiran previously held roles as Lead Economist and Senior Product Head at Frontier Research. He has been part of numerous economic and business forums, both locally and internationally, as a speaker, panelist, and moderator. Shiran is also a contributing writer to LMD Monthly Economic Outlook column and an alumnus of US International Visitor Leadership Program. Shiran is also a member of the Investment Advisory Panel of Soft Logic Investment and was recently appointed to the Board of Biodiversity in Sri Lanka. Shiran holds a Bachelor in Economics and Finance from the University of London, holder of the ACMA and CGMA professional qualification, a postgraduate diploma in international relations from BCIS, and an executive MBA from the Postgraduate Institute of Management in Sri Lanka. Thank you very much, our esteemed panel, for joining with us today. The panel is set to have 3 rounds of questioning, a general question that will be posed to the entire panel, a focus question that will be posed more focused question posed to particular panelists in the second round, and then the final round will also have a general question followed by questions and answers session with the physical audience and the virtual audience. Thank you, everyone. So to start off, my first question to the panel is the purpose of this conversation was to kind of venture into the topic of economic justice from different vantage points that we are representing today from your specific areas of expertise. Given that, my first question to you is, how do you define economic justice in relation to your own area of expertise? What does economic justice entail? And what parameters need to be set out in defining it in relation to the Sri Lankan context? I would open the floor with Economist and then move on to...
Thank you, Mythri and CPA for inviting me for this. It's my first engagement here as well, so it's good that the private sector is also a part of this conversation. I'll start off by saying I'm not an expert on the topic, but I'll bring my economist hat on as well. I think the executive director kind of outlined what economic justice is from an economist point of view, so I'll try to give it more from a practical point of view, and maybe even touch on some of the things you mentioned on fiscal tax, some of those things as well. So I think if we look at the current economic crisis, I think the manifestation, you have different triggers. You have things which we didn't do for a long time, or reforms we didn't do for a long time, or that culminating in it. Of course, you had triggers like the tax cuts in 2019. You had the triggers like COVID. And then you have a lot of policy missteps along the way. So all of that is, has really pushed back a lot of people's aspiration. And I think that in itself is, lost justice. And a lot of people a lot of people who come to me as an economist ask me, is there hope in Sri Lanka? That's your foundation of complete loss of faith, or that economic justice is completely gone out of proportion. There is faith in Sri Lanka. I'll get back to you in that in a bit as well. But if you look at the different tenets of how we kind of can deliver economic justice, and I want to be very forward thinking it as well. I think when you think of the 4-5 tenets, one is of course fiscal, and that relates to what the executive director said in terms of taxation policy. Historically, we have not been very fair in the way we've approached our taxation policy. If you look at direct to indirect taxes, your indirect taxes, we've always favored going for easier things like VAT, which is across the board. There's nothing progressive about it. Everyone, whether you're on the higher income scale or the low income scale, you end up paying the same level. And unfortunately, even in the recent increases, we've kind of used VAT as a tool because simply it's easier to collect, and because of the revenue administration issues that you mentioned, we've always favored that, and we've not gone on the other direction. And then you have the other spectrum of it when you try to introduce these reforms and try to introduce taxation to those who actually owe it, especially those who probably benefited from taxpayers' money through their education from grade 1 to 13, then their their undergraduate, all that from good taxpayer money, from tax money that most of the taxpayers pay. Then you should come to a point where you actually pay what's due, regardless of profession. And I think that's the justice I see, which is everyone has a view of corruption, everyone has a view on, oh, government is spending too much. But when it comes to yourself, it's tax everyone but me attitude, which I think is completely wrong. And if you speak to a lot of people like Shamnikure and the others who are trying to help us at this point in time, you can't demand accountability, you can't demand expenditure cuts by having only 67,000 income tax files in Sri Lanka, which is what we had at the end of 2021. Probably it has gone to maybe 100,000 by the end of 22. When you have an overall employed population of 8 million, remove 4 million of it, because 4 million is probably the formal population. You can't demand that unless you're part of the system that is paying taxes. And I think that's the crucial part which we need to deliver in these reforms. So if you look at 2019 for the tax cuts, you had about 1.2 million tax files out of maybe the 4 million at that point. So you had some level of tax base at that point, still not enough. If you equate what a proxy should be, you can look at, we all now have got so used to QR codes, we're using vehicles, but the best part of it is how many people have vehicles. 6 million people have vehicles, you remove the motorcycles, you remove the trishaws, you remove maybe a certain part where some people have maybe 2 or 3 vehicles, you would arrive at about 3.5 to 4 million people who can afford a vehicle. Affording a vehicle means you go to a bank, or you're financing out of your own equity. Going to a bank means you have to show some level of income. It has to be a decent level of income because the bank doesn't give you 100%, they'll give you 60 to 70%. So there is that base. It's just that base is not getting connected. And a lot of that goes out of the system. Or if you're in the system, you know how to game the system. And a lot of the professions you mentioned, I'm not going to say those professions, but everyone in this room who's nodding their head knows it. And has seen it probably when they've gone for these consultations. They have to be part of the system, and it's unfortunate that they're the ones on the street griping when it's tax everyone but me policy. So I think that's the shift we need to see, because if we can have at least 2 million, 3 million taxpayers, then we can hold everyone accountable. Then we can hold our politicians accountable. We can hold our officials accountable, because you have the power. Right now with 100,000 taxpayers, and 100,000 also is a duplicate number, because you have people like me who pay payee, and I also file a tax return. For no godly reason, I have to file a tax return as well, even though I pay payee. I keep telling the Internal Revenue Department, I'm already paying payee, why do I need to pay another tax file? But I don't have the means to close a tax file, which maybe other professionals are able to do. So I think that's the start of it. Then we take something like state-owned enterprise reform, which is something politically which has always been challenging. We've always pushed back. I mean, the current president, when he was prime minister 20 years ago, one of the key things he tried to do was limit the public number of people working in the public sector. And one of the reasons he got booted out at that time was because he tried to curb that. 20 years later, he's trying to do the same thing, which is, you can imagine how delayed we are on this reform. And that is 20, and last year you had about 30,000 retiring from the public sector, and you didn't really see any hiring coming in. But across the board, if you look at SOE reform, I mean, when we think of SOEs, we think of Sri Lanka Electricity Board, we think of CPC, we think of Sri Lankan Airlines, but there is a multitude. You have about 500 state-owned institutions. A lot of them are sometimes regulatory, sometimes government, but you have about 130 commercial SOEs. And of the 130 commercial SOEs, most of them are at least profitable. Some of them are duplicates. So, for example, if you look at something like fertilizer distribution, you have about 3 or 4 of them. If you look at plantation factories, you have about 3 or 4 of them. So there is scope within that to reduce the duplication and then bring a bit more productivity. And then when you take in the loss-making ones as well, I think we don't understand how interconnected each one is. So if I take a prime example, CPC, for example, they import fuel. That fuel goes for electricity generation to CEP. CEP has to pay CPC. When CEP doesn't pay CPC, CPC is in trouble. CPC also brings in the jet fuel, which goes to Sri Lankan Airlines, and that jet fuel is given at a premium to Sri Lankan Airlines. So Sri Lankan Airlines is also not on the best footing. And all 3 of them rely on borrowings from the state banks. The state banks happily lend because they can get a nice percentage on the loan yield and lend. And of course, when we had access to capital markets, they were able to get the dollars in and able to lend. But what that has happened is it's squeezed out the lending that can go to the private sector, that can go to people. And because the entire credit is got crunched onto this. And when we had the economic crisis last year, the state spending on state bailout of these SOEs came to the private sector banks, whose main shareholders are the depositors that come to them as well. So I think there needs to be greater understanding of why we need to do these reforms because of how interconnected it is. And I think the reason we've gone to the IMF 16 times is we've always done the macro stabilization part of the IMF program, but we've not done the other reform part of it. We've been very happy to stabilize the economy, let the currency go, let interest rates adjust, do a little few things here that the IMF wants, and we'll roll on to the next program. But we never end up doing some of the SOE-related reform that is really required. So I think we're seeing a little bit of progress on that, and maybe we can touch base a bit on that as well. Then the other aspect of this justice, I feel, is competition. I think if you look at the state sector, and if you even look at certain private sectors, there is not enough competition. So you have a lot of inefficiencies, you have rent seekers, so on and so forth. So I think there in itself, because of all these inefficiencies, who loses? It's the consumer. The consumers end up paying higher things. You have higher tariffs, which because of our trade policy, we have a very distorted trade tariff policy, which we're now trying to somehow streamline as well. So at the end of the day, the consumer is the one that loses out as well. And the other side of it is I think the institutional reforms that are required to deliver the economic justice or the economic programs that the people require. And I think that's where I think regardless of who we elect or who we have, or if you have a visionary leader, a president with a vision, you lack the runners. And what I mean by the runners is the institutions. You lack people, the bureaucratic people, the ones at a secretary level or the heads of an institution to be able to take a particular reform and execute it. And most often than not, that's why you have a lot of donor agencies, World Banks, all of them, consultants coming in, and them trying to run the program. So when they run it, there is no ownership taken. So once that program finishes 3-4 years later, the ones who are in these institutions don't want to carry it forward. I mean, the classic example is things like the Indian Revenue Department ramming system. Brought in under the last program, worked for a good while, and now there's so many problems, no one wants to really solve it. So I think the medium to long-term way out of this crisis is, of course, export-led investment, and we can get into that discussion, but really institutional reform, so that you have runners, you have implementers who can, whether you agree or disagree with the government or the president of the day, you're at least able to implement some of the reform process, because all of this ensures one thing that the private sector always keeps talking about, which is policy consistency and a level playing field. That is all the private sector needs if they are to truly be the engine of growth, which is something which the governments of subsequent governments shout about, but we never really look at it as well. I'll just clarify two things on a couple of things you said as well. I think the comparisons to like a Thailand crisis is a little difficult, because Thailand crisis was they had a really good fiscal picture. There was no issues on the fiscal side. It was mainly private capital that went out, and I think so their ability to give gold and all of that, I think, was kind of justified. So it's a bit difficult comparing parallels. And the other one, maybe just on a subtle note, on the apartment side, they did increase apartment rates. So the apartment rates, which are on the GP2 classification, has gone all the way up to what the tourism sector and what government officers pay. So they are in a higher bracket. So that justice has been delivered as well.
Thank you, Shiran. I would like to ask the same question now from Ms. Bhavani Fonseka. So justice, economic justice from more governance and policy perspective.
Thank you, Mythri and CEPA, for having this discussion. It's important to have this, but it's also it's an issue that's been confronting Sri Lankans for several decades, but it's because of the economic crisis that we've started really exploring different dimensions. So I'll speak to what I understand in terms of my own experience, but I also raise some issues that we need to factor in. It follows from the points made in terms of institutional reform, because that's kind of, if you don't address it, we are going to have these conversations over and over again. But maybe just start with, what does justice mean? And justice is very broadly looking at equality, non-discrimination, fairness, ensuring equity, and all of those issues. And when we talk about justice, and in the Sri Lankan context, one of the big things that not everyone wants to talk about is the structural violence that's been there for decades. And this is not, again, something post-war. We're talking about during independence, post-independence, cycles of violence, what led to the cycles of violence, a near 3-decade war. And with the pandemic, it came up again. So, Sri Lanka has been confronted with issues of justice for decades. Justice in terms of racial, class, gender, sexuality, and our own constitution addresses some of it in terms of the fundamental rights chapter, in terms of talking about equality, Article 12. So one would say we have a constitution, at least, that recognizes some dimensions, and I speak from a lawyer's point of view here, but our own constitution, with its own flaws, recognizes there has to be equality and non-discrimination. Is it fully implemented? Of course not. That's why we go to court and challenge these things. But there are also things that are not addressed, or while it's in the paper, or there could be excellent policies, it's not fully implemented. So the cycles of violence and inequalities, if you look at it from the ethno-religious violence from the 1915 onwards, you have this. We've had these things that have been there for a long time. And the heart of it is impunity, that when you don't address the root causes, when you don't address accountability, and accountability has been thrown a bit in terms of the economic dimension, but accountability on the political violence, on the socio-economic. So you're not going to address the corruption issues and accountability if you don't address the bigger issues in Sri Lanka. Political identity, about how citizens are treated, if that's not addressed, we are not going to address the economic crimes. So when we talk about justice and economic justice, we need to recognize justice cannot be taken in just silos. And again, we were confronted with this in 2015 when the then government initiated transitional justice and a whole new social contract by way of a new constitution, and various issues around transitional justice. And this thing about what does justice was confronted at that time, and some of us had those conversations. What does justice mean? But that's the unfortunate thing. Now we are faced by this exceptional economic crisis, but those issues were not addressed for decades. So justice, in a way, cannot be picked to suit a particular time or circumstance. And that's just not going to address the root causes, the structural issues. So when we talk about economic justice, my main point is we need to look at the bigger picture. We need to look at, the issues of food insecurity, health issues, labor, land, all of these things that affect a whole lot of people, and also the citizen mobilization over the decades, raising these issues need to be confronted. So when we talk about economic justice, these are all interconnected. That's why I think it's a great panel, because we bring in the different perspectives. I bring in the legal and the others bring in different perspectives. We can't address the one and think everything else is going to follow. So having the perfect law is not going to address all these issues. Having the perfect structure is not going to address all of these issues. So but someone else had a point. So for me, economic justice needs to be looked at holistically and looking at the different dimensions. Now, while we're confronted, and I like the point you raised about the HRC resolution. Now, for the first time, the Human Rights Council last year brought in economic crimes. But it brought in economic crimes through a resolution that started with looking at the legacy of the war, the human rights violations that have occurred for decades. And their point is, these are interconnected, that impunity is interconnected. If you don't address impunity in one, you cannot address the economic crimes, the economic justice. So I will make this point, which I think some have now started to make, is you can't treat things as saying we will address corruption and think the other problems in Sri Lanka are going to be addressed, are going to be solved overnight in a miraculous way. So you have to address why are those structural violations, inequalities there for so many decades. Post-independence, 75 years of independence, we still have these issues. We still have a debate as to why is the 13th Amendment such a big issue in Sri Lanka, which has been there in the law books for more than 3 decades. So Human Rights Resolution of 2022 just made a very simple link that some of us have been saying for so many years. If you don't address abuses, if you don't address the cycles of violence, that impunity remains. And that impunity emboldens the political and bureaucratic elite to do what they have done, which has got us into this situation in Sri Lanka. So like it or not, you have to address the fact that in Sri Lanka, citizens have been treated differently by successive governments, by the state, by fellow citizens. So economic justice, while we can say, yes, we can address corruption, we need to have strong institutions, and I'll get to some of the reforms maybe in the second part of the conversation, but my main thrust is that economic justice cannot be addressed as a siloed issue. It needs to be addressed in terms of equality for all citizens. It is a political issue. You can't make it just an economic issue. If you don't have the proper framework, if you have a constitution, and I mean, this is something I'm going to put out there. If you have a constitution that privileges one religion over the other, Article 9, which says Buddhism is supreme, but the same constitution further down says equality for all citizens, you're not going to address those structural issues. So it may be unpopular, but I'm just saying, and we did a poll recently which said 54% feel, 54% of the citizenry feel that that issue needs to be addressed. That equality doesn't come when our own constitution privileges one community over the other, and a few articles down says equality for all. So we have a constitution in itself that creates hierarchies. When you have a constitution that creates hierarchies, when you have structural inequalities that continue to fester under different governance, there is a problem. And the question, and I'll leave it here, is who benefits by these hierarchies? Who benefits if there's impunity? Who benefits if these problems are not addressed? And you come to the present issue. Why are we in this crisis? Why is it last year we had an exceptional citizen movement that got a hugely popular government out of office? Fast forward 6 months later, even the conversation about accountability is limited. Why is it that now there is an attempt to delay or postpone elections, a democratic right of the citizenry, and very few people are even having this conversation? So it comes back to democratic processes, fundamental rights, institutions that treat citizens equally. And it goes to the heart of the issue in terms of governance. It's a crisis of governance. A crisis of governance that is very much linked to the structure of the state. A hugely powerful executive president, corruption that is not checked, checks and balances that are not effective. So that connects to the second part in terms of what reforms we need to look at. But these are structural issues that goes to the heart of the issue of the inequalities and the impunity. So there's a lot there, but I think we need to confront these unpopular, often forgotten, sidelined issues if you have to talk about justice.
Thank you, Bhavani.